Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caitlin McGee, representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the ISO, and I'll be helping facilitate today's meeting. I'm also joined by Juan Vitrago, Account Manager, Sylvie Spiewak, Senior Policy Developer, and Guillermo Bautista Alderete, Director of Market Analysis and Forecasting. Again, this is the Price Formation Enhancements Working Group Session 6. And as a reminder, the presentation and agenda for this meeting can be found on the initiative webpage, which is under the Stay Informed tab of the California ISO's website. Next slide, please. Before we get started today, a few housekeeping reminders. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. These are collaborative working groups. They're intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives, but we do ask that you please keep comments professional and respectful. If you have any questions, you can send them to me, Caitlin McGee, via the chat today. I'm covering for Brenda Corona today. Next slide, please. And if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question during today's meeting, there's a few ways to do that through WebEx. First, if you're logged into WebEx using your computer or the Call Me option, you can click the raise hand icon at the bottom right of your screen in the toolbar. This will add you to the queue and we'll call on you when it's time to ask your question or make your comment. If you're joining us through an audio-only line, you can press #2. That'll also add you to the queue. And if you prefer, you can put your question or comment into the chat and me or Juan will read it aloud for you today. There has been an update to the WebEx platform, and so if you do mute yourself, it'll lock you. So when you're called upon, just remember to not press mute until you've completed your comment or question. Next slide, please. Here's today's agenda for the working group meeting. So just going through the housekeeping slides and providing a quick overview of today's meeting. Then I'll hand it over to Juan to talk about today's goals and the next session. And then Sylvie will walk us through a revisit of fast start pricing. And Guillermo will take us through an analysis on fast start pricing. And then Juan will help us through an open discussion on FSP analysis. And I'll close it out with some next steps before we wrap up today's meeting. Next slide, please. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this graphic, but again, this is the ISO's policy initiative stakeholder process. And as you can see, we're here at the very beginning of the proposal development phase, going through the working groups. And this is really helping us inform the phase 1 straw proposal. Next slide. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Juan to take us through working group deliverables today.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you everybody for joining us. We are going to be discussing the scoping for a fast start pricing analysis. So this is a pretty common, or should be a familiar slide for you, but I did kind of change this up. I left the image here because we are going to take an iterative approach, and that will be explained in further detail here in a little bit. But today's session is taking a step away from the scarcity and BAA level market power mitigation conversation and picking up the fast start pricing analysis, which is really the deliverable for this working group. At the end of this session, or I'm sorry, at the end of this working group for phase 1, we would like to have this scoped out. So we're seeking your feedback on the development of that scope, and that analysis is meant to allow for a robust discussion in subsequent phases on the potential inclusion of fast start pricing within the California ISO markets. So you are going to have an opportunity to provide written comment on this scope. You're going to have an opportunity to come back in subsequent working group sessions. So there'll be multiple rounds of feedback and fine tuning, much more on that to come a little bit later. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide, please. So I like to try to frame the conversation for each session. What are the goals of today's working group? At the end of this session, we hope you walk away with ISO having provided a history and context of fast start pricing here at the California ISO, to frame that discussion and to provide, the necessary information to develop that scope. We are also joined by Guillermo Bautista-Alderete and Quinn Zhao to talk a little bit more about that analysis scoping. So we're going to present an approach to that fast start pricing analysis with a couple illustrative examples, and then we will close out the session with stakeholder feedback and an open discussion on what you as a stakeholder community would like to see in that analysis in order to ensure that we can have that robust discussion in the future. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide, and I'd like to hand this off to Sylvie Spiewak, our Senior Policy Developer. Sylvie, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Juan. Let's see if my camera will go on. There we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Sylvie Spiewak. I'm a Senior Policy Developer with the California ISO, and I am here to give you a brief high-level overview of fast start pricing. Go to the next slide. Why revisit fast start pricing? The basic problem that fast start pricing is intended to solve isn't new, and we've had a lot of previous conversations around the topic. So this presentation is intended to just be high level, review what it is, how the CAISO has addressed it in the past, but we've decided to revisit fast start pricing in acknowledgement that price formation must be tailored to the unique characteristics of the market it serves. Different system conditions impact dispatch and pricing, and the CAISO is open to the possibility that some form of fast start pricing could better meet the needs of a broad regional market. And we'll want to take a look at what the benefits of fast start pricing are, as they depend on resource fleets, system conditions, and existing market rules. Next slide. Over the winter, the CAISO hosted a few workshops aimed at level setting on the mechanics and the idea behind fast start. So if you'd like a more in-depth review of these concepts, I can point you towards the recordings of those meetings. They should be available on our stakeholder page. We'll start with just the characteristics of a resource with lumpy costs. Typically, an LMP is set by the resource that can be incremented up or down in response to changes in demand. But inflexible operational limits like a min load won't set the LMP, and that's because it cannot respond to changes in demand. Similarly, commitment costs don't change with the change in demand. So only that top operational area between 75 and 100 of this resource is eligible to set the LMP. Just because the rest of it doesn't mean it's inefficient. Our real-time pre-dispatch ensures efficiency by taking all costs into account. Even if they don't impact the LMP, it's considered when we optimize, so that gives us an efficient least cost solution. Next slide. Now, let's talk about fast start pricing. Fast start resources are resources that can be dispatched quickly in response to sudden changes in load to support reliability. The resource that you saw on the previous slide could be considered a fast start resource if it can come online quickly. Fast start pricing addresses the lumpy costs that are not traditionally included in the LMP by shifting them into the LMP. Fast start resources become more important as the demand for ramping capacity increases. This is something that the CAISO has been experiencing and dealing with for many years with the increase of variable renewable energy. So we'll take a look at different ways to address these ramps. Next slide. I'm going to go through a simple example to show some of these impacts. So if you just eyeball it, you might assume that Unit 1 gets dispatched to its max, and Unit 2 sets the price if you need 250 megawatts of demand. However, that doesn't yield an optimal result. If you go to the next slide, just doing it in merit order would end up resulting in a power balance violation. You see a control error of 25 megawatts at the end because of that inflexible operational range, which means we have to schedule some of that unit ahead of time. Next slide. Starting Unit 2, before you start Unit 1, would allow Unit 1 to be the marginal unit and respond to the actual system changes. Because Unit 1 is cheaper, Unit 2 is more expensive, you would need multi-interval optimization or something similar to solve this. Otherwise, you would get that power balance violation like we saw on the previous slide. Next slide. Great. So my AirPods are about to die, and I apologize to everyone. So what's the marginal price if we end up dispatching Unit 2 to its operational max? Well, Unit 1 can respond to changes in demand. Unit 2 is the more expensive one, so what do we do? Next slide. If we allow Unit 1 to set the marginal cost, we would have to provide uplift to Unit 2 in order to allow it to recover its costs and dispatch and be ready in case demand increases beyond that 300 megawatts. In this case, everyone's costs are covered, and uplift makes sense because this is a discrete cost that doesn't respond to changes in system conditions. Next slide. If we allow Unit 2 to set the price, Unit 1 now receives profit compared to the other solution, but we may also need to pay Unit 1 an opportunity cost because the price is now higher than its bid cost. It has an incentive to dispatch to its max. Next slide. There's two commonly shared components of fast start pricing. What we just looked at is the minimum output relaxation, and in previous workshops, we've also looked at other ways to do this, including the inclusion of commitment costs in pricing. This is where marginal prices incorporate startup costs and min-load costs. Methodologies will vary regionally depending on the potential benefits and underlying problem statements. Next slide. As I mentioned, methodology varies regionally. This is a very small snapshot of some of the different characteristics we see in fast start pricing for other markets. If you want to know how fast is quickly or how fast is fast start, in MISO, they require that fast start resources can start up in an hour or less. And you can see the range across different regions. It varies in terms of its applicability to day ahead in real time. You see some of these rules depend on system conditions like shortage or emergency pricing. But if you'd like to learn more about that, we have a breakdown of the key elements of all of these regional designs in the price formation issue paper from last July. Next slide. So There's been a lot of attention around the FERC Notice of Proposed Rulemaking back from December 15th, 2016, which addressed fast start price formation. They noted that because commitment costs are incurred close to the same time as incremental energy costs, this could be seen as something that should be reflected in the LMP. They also noted that reflecting commitment costs in the LMP would reduce uplift and support efficient investments in ramping capacity. The CAISO responded to this, and I'll go through some of the details in our response on the next slide. But basically, FERC ultimately decided not to issue a final rule given the regional variations and the different applicability that fast start would have in these markets. I think I saw Sybil had a question. What startup time would align best with current CAISO markets? Don't know the answer to that. Something that hopefully we can find out at some point. But before moving into how to formulate fast start, we are going to take the first step in seeing what are the potential impacts in the market. And Guillermo will walk us through that. Next slide. These are some of the potential or intended benefits that FERC described in their Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. We've also heard a lot from our stakeholder community about other potential benefits that fast start can have in the market. So this is just a small snapshot of our reasoning to date behind why we didn't agree with FERC's NOPR, but there's a lot more to get into in terms of trade-offs, potential benefits, potential impacts, et cetera. But on a basic level, the FERC NOPR said this will reduce reliance on uplift. In response, CAISO noted that non-convex costs require some sort of uplift. And as we saw in the example previously, no matter which unit set the price, you either needed to provide uplift or an opportunity cost payment in order to keep incentives aligned. So fast start shifts the potential source of uplift, but and maybe an interesting question down the line to determine whether or not uplift is inherently bad, what sources of uplift exist, are they all from this problem in particular? But really, at the end of the day, the important thing is the intention of these incentives matter in the broader context of the market. So if the purpose of fast start is to increase that price signal and ensure efficient unit commitment and dispatch support system ramping needs, CAISO noted that the current market, the multi-interval optimization the market uses can take those non-marginal prices into account and ensure that dispatch is consistent with bids over a broad market horizon. The other implication of the FERC NOPR was that fast start would increase the transparency of price signals to support dispatch. So we do note that multi-interval optimization doesn't solve everything. However, the CAISO's flexible ramping product can fill in this last gap. When there is uncertainty around what we'll need in real time, flexible ramping product prices provide that transparent price signal. And it's separate from the energy signal, which increases its transparency. Next slide. So I'm going to try and stay away from the conversation around benefits for now, because before we do that, we really need to see how it's going to affect the market. At a high level, here's some of the basic impacts we might expect. Fast start would increase LMPs in the market pricing run. And as it applies to real time, these higher LMPs may not just impact load, there may be surplus awarded to inframarginal resources in the supply stack. We're also uncertain about what its impact on uplift is going to be. So that's something that we will have to explore. Fast start may require make-whole payments and opportunity cost payments. And what those trade-offs mean will likely be a conversation down the line. I think I saw a question in the chat.
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions here. So I'll read these out to you. So John Fulgerson from PGE, who is responsible for uplift and opportunity cost payments in that example? Is it load?
Yes. There are different ways that we do cost allocation from uplift and opportunity cost payments. Off the top of my head, I don't want to tell you anything wrong, but we can get you more information on that.
And then we have, so Stuart, I want to recognize your hand, but I want to do a couple of these chat questions that came in. We have one from Alva. How do other ISOs determine the period over which a fast start adder applies? Is it the same as startup time, as long as fast start resource is committed?
James, you might be
James, you want to take that one?
better versed in the world of other ISOs.
Yeah, my understanding is that the answer varies. My understanding is that some ISOs apply the fast start pricing adder only over the minimum runtime, and other ISOs apply the fast start pricing adder over the entire period with which the unit is on. So there's varying practices.
Yeah, my take as well is that it varies according to what the problem statement they see in the market is. Are they experiencing shortages during certain times, or just attempting to incent more resources at that point?
Yes, Sylvie, this is Mike Cadwallader. If I could toss something in too, please.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Mike.
Yeah. Hi. This is, for those who might not remember, I'm the ISO's consultant advising them on fast start pricing. But anyway, there are alternatives to both of those choices. For example, in New York, the startup costs are actually allocated to the first 15 minutes. Even though you may have a 30-minute minimum runtime, it's allocated to the first 15 minutes based upon analysis that was conducted that basically concluded that, by and large, the reason why these units are started is to meet load within the next 15 minutes. And so even though they're going to be running for another 30 minutes, at least, that's in most cases essentially just completing the minimum runtime. The true reason why they're running is to meet fairly immediate term load. So startup costs are only allocated in the first 15 minutes.
Thanks, Mike.
All right, we have two more in the chat, and then we'll go to Stuart here. What startup time would align best with current CAISO market?
Oh, I think I addressed that one already, but let's see. I think there's other similar questions in here. How would you apply it over the entire time that it's on? A lot of questions in the chat are about, methodology, how we would do it, why we would do it. And it's a little premature to be talking about those things before we understand some of the basic market impacts. And hopefully we can identify as a group where the potential problems are. If there's a lot of uplift occurring in the market as a consequence of these non-convex supply stacks, or whatever else is going on. I don't want to take away from Guillermo's conversation. James?
Yeah, I just want to, if people can see in the chat, I wanted to circle on Sybil's question about how do you apply it over the time the unit is on. And I might ask Mike for some help on this, but it seems to me that if you're applying fast start pricing in the day ahead market, where you're optimizing for a 24-hour period, you would know precisely what intervals or hours a fast start unit would be committed. And then when you apply your modified offer curve for that resource, you could apply it over the period with which it's running. Now, in the real-time market, when you have sort of more limited horizons to consider, it seems to me that that may be challenging because you may not know in certain real-time market intervals how long exactly you're going to keep that unit online for. So, Mike, is there any insight you could help us with on that issue?
Yeah, I'd say that you'd still, I believe, would be able to at least have an expectation in real time as to exactly how long you're expecting that unit to run. You're incurring startup costs, and so you've got advisory schedules, and so to the extent that you may be able to use that to go ahead and perform this calculation. So I'm thinking that in general, it at least would be possible to go ahead and say, gee, this unit has a minimum runtime of 30 minutes, but I'm actually expecting it to run for an hour. So instead of allocating the cost over 30 minutes, I'm going to allocate it for an hour.
Great, thank you both. And yeah, I just want to echo what Caitlin put in the chat. Unfortunately, the WebEx platform is having these visible to panelists only, but we will be reading them aloud. So CD, I see yours, but Stuart, you've been very patiently waiting with your hand raised. So let's go ahead and unmute Stuart.
Hey, Stuart, second working group today.
Can you hear me okay? Hi.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, second working group today. Yeah, I just don't want to lose sight of comments that were raised earlier, and maybe they fold into ultimately the problem statement. But what problem are we trying to solve here? Is this just simply allowing fast start resources to set the price, or other markets have come forward with fast start pricing for different reasons, and maybe Mike can do a little bit of research on that just to say, here is the problem that we're trying to solve with fast start pricing. I know this was raised before, and I also worry a little bit about fast start pricing, because if this is a BA specific issue, and let's take CAISO for example, let's say CAISO have an issue that they want to resolve with fast start pricing just because of the mix of generation available to them, then fast start pricing at a minimum, and Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, is going to add at least $2 per megawatt hour annually based on empirical data that's out there to the cost of energy for customers. And if this is a BA specific issue, then you potentially are socializing those costs amongst other BAs that may not have a quality of generation or mix of generation issue. So I think it's important to understand what problem we're trying to solve with fast start pricing, because that would allow certainly me to weigh the merits or benefits of it, if we could at least outline the problem we're trying to solve.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too. That's why I tried to tee up the whole conversation by narrowly defining the problem as this non-convex supply stack that does have a lot of associated implications. So a lot of many of the points that you just made, Stuart, I think are going to be great ones to think about down the line once we get a good baseline understanding of how fast start would impact the market. But I look forward to you engaging further and asking those questions. Oh.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I could, this is James. If I could add on, so a couple of comments. So one on the $2 figure, we're expecting to see, and Guillermo will talk about, an energy LMP impact. There's no doubt about that. We don't know yet, what the size of that estimate will be. And the distribution of that estimate is also really, really important, because you're going to have probably zero impact in some hours and some days, and a larger impact on certain days and certain hours. And also, your point is also about sort of the geographic distribution of benefits. And your comment was sort of focused on the CAISO, but we actually are thinking about it a little differently, in the sense that it's not a CAISO specific problem that we're trying to solve. It's exploring the opportunity that fast start pricing provides a better price formation or for a broader regional market, which includes, a resource mix that's different than, the one just within the CAISO BA, and potentially that results in, something that the regional market would move forward with. And the distributional impact is not just over time, but over location too. So one of the things that's really important to think about in analysis, to the extent we can do it, is to see where in the Western EIM are price impacts most felt, because of transmission constraints or transport constraints and other things. So that's another really important thing. And we don't have answers yet, but those are the types of questions we're trying to understand what stakeholders have, so we can guide the analysis to be answering them. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that definitely helps, James, and I'll look forward to those analytics. And I agree, the $2 per megawatt hour figure will be, it'll be, focused in certain, times of the year, all accepted. But I do look forward to the analytics, because I do get concerned that fast start pricing is just another way of paying long start resources more money. But the analytics will prove or disprove that. So thank you for that. It's helpful.
I want to note that it's 1:34, and I'd really like to give the analytics conversation what it's due. If you have any other questions on how Fast Start works, or what the goals are with Fast Start policy moving forward, you can always reach out to us, put it in comments. I think I'd like to wrap it up and pass it off.
Okay, Juan, is it time now?
Yeah.
Yes, we can see you and hear you, Guillermo. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Can we move to the next slide, please? Hello, this is Guillermo. And this is a very good way to come to the second part of the conversation, because all these questions, all these comments regarding why do we need the FSP, what are the impacts, and what are we trying to solve, is really pointing to the fact that we are in a place where we need to have more basics of the potential implications of having fast start pricing. And what better way to do that through analytics? And for those of you participating in previous efforts in different initiatives, we always try to make these informed policy initiatives based on data, on analytics. That can help us to guide the conversation, try to shed light on some items that may not be that obvious in the abstract, and start raising questions that are possible only when you start looking into the implications and looking into the specific prices, costs, and changes of the market solution. Because of that, we believe this is the right time to start going into exploring what potentially are the implications for implementing one type of fast start pricing. And what we want to do is that, concurrent with the discussion that we're having regarding the principles, the problem statement, we want to start working on the analytics. That eventually is going to give us a good reference to guide the discussion. Now, we would like to time this effort along the overall effort of fast start pricing. Similar to previous efforts, what we want to do here is a stage approach. We want to go first with what we believe is the type of basics analytics that we have to do regardless of what the specific details are going to be implemented eventually if we do anything. And then have an opportunity, an iteration with market participants to learn and get an opportunity to discuss what we are seeing, potentially reshape the scope, the direction of the analytics, and come into a second phase. With that second phase, hopefully we can have a well-defined scope of what the analytics should be looking at. And again, this is with intent to have this foundational understanding of the potential implications and even potentially the permutations that could be discussed for implementation. As Sylvie indicated earlier today, one of the nuances of implementing fast start pricing is that there may be more than one dimension to the problem that you can have control, and each of those permutations may have a different outcome in different aspects of the market. So it's important to gauge that implication by making different choices in the actual implementation of this fast start pricing. That is the reason we are coming at this stage to start working on this and get your feedback. I think this is great time and opportunity to hear from you and try to connect the dots of how that concern, how that statement could fit into a specific direction of the analysis that needs to be done in order to have that more informed landscape in the discussion of the fast start pricing initiative. If we can go to the next slide, please. Sylvia already covered the basics, and let me just reorient this in the context of the analysis that we are expecting to start with. The whole point of this is predicated on the nature of the cost. We have the variable bidding cost, that is a continuous operational range between the Pmin and the Pmax of the resource. We have this discrete commitment cost associated with the minimum load cost, with the startup cost, and even in some cases with the transition cost for those units that are multi-stage generation. A transition cost is no more than the coupling of one shutdown and one startup. These lumpy costs have these implications when using a cost minimization problem that they are going to actively define the marginality of the price. And the whole fast start pricing is predicated on that concept. When you look at different ways to factor in for that lumpiness of the commitment cost, there is, regardless of the variation, there is a very basic principle. If we can move to the next slide, please. And that basic principle, in general, is about accounting for that discrete cost, that discrete operational range, in such a way that in the pricing of the market, we can find a way to internalize that component. Next slide, please, operator. And again, there are different ways how this can be achieved, but still the main concept, the basic principle is kind of the same. We have these multi-step segment bids that reflect the marginal variable cost, and then we have this lumpy cost between the zero and the Pmin. In general, the fast start pricing, the things to apply is to first make the discrete startup point flexible. That means instead of the unit that can only start from the Pmin all the way to Pmax, we can relax that discreteness and ensure that the unit within the pricing mechanism is allowed to be dispatched anywhere in its operational range all the way to zero. So we relax, make flexible the range between zero and the Pmin. And then the second component, and again, different permutations can be applied, has to do with the internalization of the discrete cost, the commitment cost, the minimum load cost, and the startup cost. And the simplest way to do it is by some fashion to have this adder to the bid. And that adder could be a two-piece adder, one for the minimum load cost, another adder for the startup cost. And again, there are different ways how you can come with that adder. There is a specific formula here for each of those based on one prototype that we did a couple of years ago. We are not saying that this is the way to go. We are not proposing that this should be the way to amortize the cost. It's just one option that we explored a couple of years ago. And in general terms, the approach is going to be, relatively speaking, about the same principle. And that is, you have the discrete cost, and you're going to divide that by the Pmax of the resource to get some type of average cost. And then, in some fashion, you add that to the original bidding component submitted by the participant. If you can see this graphically, what it means is that you are going to move up potentially symmetrically or concurrently every segment of the bid stack, or in a different way if you approach this with a different calculation, and then extend the first segment of the bid all the way to zero to ensure that now you have a range, a continuous range to be able to dispatch the resource anywhere between 0 and the PMIN. And with that, now we have that information available that is a kind of a non-lumpy approach to be able to be used in the pricing run of the market to determine the price. Typically, what we have is that this relaxation, this simplification, this additional flexibility holds for the run that sets the price, that forms the price. And effectively, in the CAISO market, we are talking specifically about the pricing run. We also have what we call the scheduling run that helps us to determine the commitments. So when we go into the pricing run, it's specifically for price discovery purposes, not to redo the commitments. Obviously, the units cannot be operating in a flexible range between 0 and PMIN. They have to be at least at the PMIN. All this is for the purpose of defining what the price should be once you are factoring in some fashion the commitment cost. Juan, do we have any questions so far?
We do have one hand raised, Guillermo. So if we could unmute John, please.
I'll do my best to keep this as short as possible. I have two questions really quickly. The first one is for this flexible start range where the price is, does that also have to be monotonically increasing, or can a price be set in there to create effectively a type of hurdle rate?
Oh no, we still need to ensure that the curves remain monotonically increasing.
Okay.
That is one of the basics that we have to preserve.
Okay. And then the other question I had is if I'm understanding correctly, that portion of generation that occurs in that range at this present moment is currently considered uninstructed imbalance energy and is treated as such. Because it's generation that can sync to the grid before you've reached your official PMIN and your GRDT. So with this new fast start pricing, it will no longer be treated as UIE. There would not be a combination of a dual treatment of it, or there will.
Okay. I hear your question. Let me try to answer in two different ways. And I think this would be a very good way to have the discussion in terms of the principles for the policy initiative. What I indicated first is that, generally speaking, the fast start pricing applies only to the pricing run to discover and to form the prices that are going to be used to settle. The vehicle to be able to achieve that in fast start pricing requires this flexibility of the start anywhere between the 0 and the PMIN. So internal to the optimization to determine the prices, the optimization may determine that the unit has to be dispatched in between that range, right, between 0 and PMIN. Let's say if the PMIN is 25, the optimization may determine that the unit has to be dispatched at 10 megawatts. That is only for price formation purposes. So strictly speaking, the unit still is going to receive a startup instruction to go to the PMIN of 25. Effectively, the unit would still receive a dispatch operating target to at least be 25 megawatts. It's not going to receive an instruction in the dead zone of 0 to P-min. It's only for pricing purposes. Now, you are raising a good point that eventually we have to discuss if we go through the formality of the policy initiatives. And I don't want to overcomplicate this, but this is part of the nuanced discussions that eventually we have to have. And what I'm referring to this is that years back, specific to the California ISO market, we implemented a pricing enhancement. And with that enhancement, we rely for both schedules and prices from the pricing run. We don't use the schedules or the awards from the scheduling run. So by the time we have to go into the discussion of fast start pricing, we have to be able to find a workable solution to reconcile fast start pricing with this pricing enhancement that relies for both the schedules and prices from the pricing run. I would say if for some reason we have to still rely on the pricing run schedules, yeah, eventually we are going to have a 25 megawatt discrete P-min, even though the schedule was 10 megawatts. That potentially can create an imbalance in the system because now the market is assuming that you have that capacity available, when in reality the unit cannot provide that. So it naturally creates an imbalance that if it is too meaningful, it could be problematic. But that is a great point of discussion that eventually we have to go into the details through the policy initiative.
And then really quickly, unfortunately, I have one more question. Based on the monotonically increasing definition that we kind of said, it would seem to be saying that this fast start pricing is going to be a discounted price to start the resources from what the current price is. Is that kind of is that the intention? Because either we set the fast start price the same as the price of the first breakpoint of the heat rate curve or of the stair step function that we use as a heat rate curve, or it will be at some lower price, right? Now you can say it could be at an average price, which fine, there's some debate about that, right? Because it's not like your startup profile is linear per se, but that average price is definitely going to be lower than your min block price or your minimum bid price that you would normally submit.
Yeah, and this is another great point. I think we have to take notes of your point that you are bringing, John, because these are great for further nuanced discussions. You are touching on the implications of what methodology we have to use to define these adjusted bids. And there are trade-offs to be made. In this very simplified approach that I'm showing here, it's a very simplistic way, right? You just come with an adder, and that adder applies concurrent to every single segment of the variable range. And there are arguments in favor or against that approach. Remember that when we clear the market, we do it it's not pay for bid. It's basically marginal pricing, right? If one upper segment of the bid is going to set the price, naturally that implies you're going to have inframarginal revenues for the lower part of the variable range. In some cases, that could be high enough to ensure that you are able to recover the cost of the minimum load cost, but in some cases it will not, right? So typically, the closer you are to the lower range of the operational range, most likely is that you may not be able to recover your cost. If you are operating the higher end and it's spiking up, the inframarginal revenues may be enough to cover your cost. So that really brings a trade-off in the discussion of what is the best approach to internalize this commitment cost. This is one approach. There may be others that could be more tailored. Potentially, you may have a different adder for every different segment to attain different outcomes. So all this comes to trade-offs, and I think this would be a great point to have the discussion. And honestly, we are open to exploring this analysis, the implications of one approach over the other. So this is the time to start thinking what permutations make sense and see what are the trade-offs for making one approach versus the other.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Do you have anything else, Juan?
We don't, Guillermo, and that was John from SRP. So just a reminder with the visibility of attendees, please do state that affiliation. But go ahead, Guillermo. We can move to the next slide.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. Well, now, this is just the preamble as to why we need to start working on the analysis. Now, how do we do it? Separate from the permutations and the different angles that we can take about implementation of the fast start pricing. Right now, we don't have a sandbox where we can just try every single permutation possible and see how the market would perform, right? Ideally, we would have this very detailed sandbox where we can play with different formulations, have all the resource and all the data input that we need, try to have some projections of the conditions, fuel prices, loads, and so on, and including potentially bidding behavior to come with an outcome to see what it means to have fast start pricing implemented. That is something that we don't have readily available, and it would be kind of onerous to try to take this approach. So what we have proposed for this session and for the scope of the analysis that we want to carry out is to do something that historically we have done. And this is kind of back of the envelope analysis and estimate using the current information available that we have from the actual market that we are running. We have all the resource characteristics, we have all the bids submitted by participants, the outages, the load forecast, the fuel prices, everything is at our disposal as long as we look retroactively. And what we typically do for this type of analysis is to reverse engineer the logic that we want to test. In this case, we know how the solution was for the real-time market or even the day-ahead market. We can start from there and try to implement a simplification of the fast start pricing for any of the permutations that we believe is going to be valuable, and assess what is the change, the implication of having that methodology implemented. And there are some trade-offs, and one of those is that we do have to take assumptions, right? We don't have this fully optimization with all the resource attributes and characteristics, all the intertemporal constraints, all the rings and bells of the current market optimization. So we have to take approximations. And one of those is that it was very hard to try to do something to account not only for energy, but also for FRP. So because we are not doing this intertemporal based back of the envelope optimization, we cannot really naturally account for the implications of FRP. It would have to be energy only. And we already know the solutions. We know how the resources were dispatched for every interval of the market. That is our starting point. Now it's a matter of setting up the system to ensure that we discover what the price would be with any variation of the fast start pricing. We can do that. Now, as you will see at the end of this deck, we did some prototype a couple of years ago when we started thinking about fast start pricing, and we created a set of scenarios. At that time, we were exploring CAISO only. So looking into one single area, I would say simplifies a lot of things. The reality is that now we have a more interconnected system with many different balancing areas participating, and it does matter. It is material how the dynamics happen among the different balancing areas. So we have here more than one option how we can approach this prototype expanded to account for, in some fashion, the implications of the extended market across the different areas. One is obviously do some type of system-wide, basically ignore the transfer limitations and just have this system-wide EIM footprint and just do a system-wide energy calculation. That would be relatively easy. We have all the resources, but it would ignore the reality of the transfers. And we know that transfers happen and they are limited in some cases depending on the area of the system. So it wouldn't be the most accurate representation of the current real-time market. So in that sense, we really need to account in some fashion for the interplays that may happen among the different areas, not only CAISO versus any other balancing area, but even within balancing areas of the EIM market. And another variation could be somehow to account for the transfers. Remember, the pricing, the fast start pricing is about the prices. We already know the schedules. We already know what the transfers were. It's a matter of setting the boundaries to be able to properly set up the pricing run. So there may be a way to account for the transfer dynamics and be able to do more of a regional area-based pricing that takes into account the regional nature and conditions of the West-wide EIM market. And with that, one limitation that we are going to have is that we have that information available for the real-time market. We do not have that for the day ahead. So naturally, this limits our options to try to do something more holistically in terms of the real-time market only. And this is our intent. And I would be happy to have that conversation of what concerns this simplified approach could be. And we have that prototype implemented for the CAISO. So it's a matter of how we can naturally expand it and account for the nuances of having a multi-area balancing market. Let me pause here when I think there may be a question.
Yeah, and James, maybe you want to take this one. Let's toss it over to you.
Are you talking about the chat question?
Yeah, let me put the chat. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, there's a chat question to say, if an MSG in this context standing for multi-stage generator, or combined cycle basically, has a short transition time between configurations, would the transition costs or increases in minimum load costs be included in the adjusted bid, or would this only apply to starts and not transitions? And Guillermo, you and I talked about this very question yesterday. Ultimately, it's a policy choice. I mean, I lean towards it making sense that transitions are included. But if the question is specifically about the analysis and whether the analysis will cover transition costs, I'll turn that to you, Guillermo.
Yeah, and you're right, James. We were just discussing that. I would say conceptually speaking, I could see the merits to apply this to transitions because, again, the transition is just the coupling of one shutdown with one startup, and there is contingent cost, discrete costs involved in that transition. So it's a natural consequence of having the multi-stage configurations. For the prototype, the original version that we have, we didn't apply that to the multi-stage generator transitions. I think that would be an item that we would assess if it is feasible to do it with this counterfactual estimate that we want to do for analytics. And to James' point, I think that is still a very key point to discuss through the principles of the policy, where to take this.
No further questions, Guillermo.
Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please. Now, in terms of the scope of the analysis, first stage, we want to have some analysis, some data to discuss with you. And this first stage, we are expecting that we can have something meaningful to share by the end of the year. Somewhere in December, I think would be ripe to discuss and share with you what we have done so far. Now, I would classify the analysis in two main groups. The first one is just basic statistics. It's not indeed closely related to the implementation of fast start pricing, but it's more about understanding and providing data to understand the context of what type of generation mix we are dealing with to get a sense how meaningful the fast start pricing is going to be, right? And as simple as out of all our supply capacity, how that comes by the time you define that by the startup time, the minimum uptime, in terms of the cost, is everything clustered in the range of 30 to 1 hour or between 1 hour and 2 hours? How meaningful is the 15-minute startup units? When it comes to cost, are they all clustered in this lumpy, spiky cost? Getting a feeling of, if we were to implement some type of faster pricing, what would be eventually the units that would be actively at play to be impacted by this methodology? And there are different dimensions to do that classification, right? The minimum uptime, the startup time, and the associated costs are default areas to stratify the data in that regard. We also know by the current market results under the current standard pricing, how much bit cost recovery has accrued over the years on the different units. An interesting way and simple way to get a sense of how material that is to use that classification of the units and associate that with the bit cost recovery, just to see where that is clustered, if in any fashion. And then the first part of this analysis would require to define what type of sensitivity scenarios we want to cover. We can have 2-3 dimensions to the problem and try to come with some permutations of these 3 dimensions to see, realistically speaking, what are possible scenarios that give us the combination of details that we want to implement. We want to implement a dimension of how long we take for the startup definition versus minimum startup time, things like that. So this first stage is very straight, very simple, relying on historical information, just getting to know the supply we are going to be dealing with that could inform us how meaningful it is to explore the different classifications and considerations of the key components that make up the fast start pricing definition. Next slide, please. And when it comes to the second stage, this is the heavy lift, because effectively it requires that we do this estimate in some fashion for the implications of fast start pricing. And we know one reference, and that is the current pricing mechanism that we have, where we don't incorporate the coordinate cost into the variable bit cost. We don't allow for this flexible dispatch between 0 and P-min. That is the very first line, the benchmark. We already have that information. Now we would have to form the prices under the same methodology with this approach. That is kind of the starting point. And after that, we have to come with a few conditions, a few scenarios that we want to assess. One of them, for instance, could be, do you want to consider that, yes, we are able to relax the 0 to P-min range to be dispatched anywhere in between, or we can still hold that to be discrete and only factor in the cost for any component of the variable range. The second scenario could be, yes, allow the flexibility to be dispatched anywhere between 0 and P-min, in addition to incorporate the coordinate cost into the variable range. And then you can start playing with another dimension, and that is, we're going to do this only for resources that are truly fast start units, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Or maybe we can relax it, how much we gain, we lose if we extend this up to 1 hour startup. And the same dimension applies when you're dealing with minimum uptime. Do you want to consider the two together or put different conditions to each of the 2 times? These are the scenarios that we have to create. We can afford to do a few of them, but we have to still be mindful to define a small set to be meaningful and targeted to ensure that we don't get lost with so many permutations, and we really want to assess what is meaningful to explore for guiding the policy discussions later on. And I would like to pause here, because I think this is where many of the questions, principles, statements are relevant, because that could define potentially different scenarios. I would like to hear if there is any feedback on this approach.
Okay, do we have anyone on the line? Oh, looks like we do, Guillermo. We have John from SRP.
So, Guillermo, could you possibly give a little bit of an additional explanation on if the model decides to dispatch within that startup range, right? Because you were saying that it'll either cross fully across that range or it could potentially give you dispatch instructions within that range. In general, I think most of us would say that we can't stop in that range, right?
Yeah.
So what is going to happen if we get an instruction that says that we stop in that range when we know we can't stop and we've most likely communicated that in our GRDTs respectively that we can't stop?
Yeah, John, regardless of the details of the potential implementation that eventually we can take care of, I don't believe we would be in a place where we are going to be sending you dispatches to operate below the PMIN. We know that is a physical reality and we don't expect that instruction to happen. We need to go back to the principle of the fast start pricing, that this is mainly and only for price formation purposes. So in the optimization, it happens that the optimal solution is to dispatch this unit in the middle of the range of between 0 and PMIN, but that is only for pricing purposes. Still, the instruction that comes out of the market will be at least to the PMIN. I don't expect that implementation of faster pricing turns out to be sending you infeasible instructions.
Okay, but so I guess keeping that in mind now, so let me definitely change my question in regards to that.
Mm-hmm.
As I'm kind of understanding what fast start pricing is trying to resolve is that the LMP price may not be at the sufficient level to call upon the next marginal resource. And what we're effectively trying to do is resolve that problem by saying that we can use the block before the min block, right, before the minimum level, we can essentially assign a price there. And then we can call on that resource based on that price, knowing that we have to take the full minimum block, but that's the next economic resource, if you would, instead of using the minimum incremental or minimum bid value that is in the market, right? So if the LMP is only at, say, $50 a megawatt hour, but all of the generation in Western EIM is already dispatched and committed, the question is how do we get the next unit to turn on when the next unit's min bid value is, say, $80 a megawatt hour, right? There's that $30 chasm kind of thing. That's what I'm understanding that you're trying to do with this process, right? Would that be a pretty good way of putting it, or no?
Yeah, well, instead of answering directly your question, let me try to put it this way. I would separate the principle versus the mechanics. The mechanics, at the end of the day, is going to indicate that in order to factor in the costs that are discrete in nature into the marginality of the solution, you are using this approximation or this relaxation of the PMIN point. That is only the mechanics to allow the market to find the price that accounts for that cost. Now, in principle, I would say that the fast start pricing is trying to ensure that these lumpy discrete commitment costs are influencing what the price is going to be, that they are factored in the determination of the price formation that otherwise wouldn't happen. Now, the consequence of all this is that internal to the optimization, the optimal solution may be that a unit can be dispatched partially between the 0 and the PMIN. Physically, we know that that is not going to happen. And this is potentially a little bit of the disconnect that the fast start pricing creates, and that is the reason that one of the items we want to track in this analysis is the volume of imbalance that is created by the fast start pricing, because any imbalance, and I define the imbalance as the difference between the PMIN and the actual dispatch of the unit below the PMIN. If your PMIN is 100 megawatts and you're dispatched to 10 megawatts, well, the market is accounting for this imbalance of 90 megawatts for the sake of setting the price for that resource, because that's all what is needed. So there are different implications between what the principles are, what the mechanics are doing, and eventually what the dispatches you are going to get. But I want to assure you that regardless of what the eventual details of the implementation is going to be, there is no expectation that you are going to be receiving infeasible dispatches. That is not the intent of the fast start pricing, and you will continue to receive eventually dispatches that are feasible, meaning at least at the PMIN, and dispatch operating targets that don't go below the PMIN. There are some nuances that we have in the market to account for when units are close to the PMIN, but that is just mechanics of the current market. It's not related to the fast start pricing. And I think James wants to add on this.
Yeah, if I may, that was a good explanation, Guillermo. I just want to emphasize the point that, you know, in terms of dispatch, the process with which we would determine your dispatch is the same as the status quo, and that will not change. And fast start pricing doesn't change that fact. You could think of it, John, as like we solve for the optimal dispatch using the as submitted offers and your commitment costs, startup costs, all those things. And then after we run a second pass where some of the assumptions in the dispatch path we change to allow for certain types of resources like the one you described in your question to set the price if they are called upon to be to serve a next increment of demand, which in the status quo, they may not have been able to set the price even though they're called upon, and then are paid an LMP potentially less than their bid price, and then are recovering costs through uplift. So think of it less in terms of how it might change your unit's dispatch, and more in terms of you know, if you know, operating these types of resources, if they are asked to come online, certain assumptions are made that enable them to set the LMP that they currently do not have the ability to do.
Right.
Thank you.
So thank you. I appreciate that. So I guess what I'm sort of getting stuck on is in terms of the principle like Guillermo's talking about, the principle is kind of saying that we are trying to resolve the problem of the discrete solutions, right? Because discrete solutions have disconnects, and we're trying to make it more continuous, is what it sounds like to me. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, instead of there being that gap in prices, so now I'm kind of moving a little into the process from the principle, right? So instead of there being that gap in the last incremental resource and the LMP, or the next incremental resource in the LMP, we are going to take this portion and do this portion of the min block, and we're going to divide it up, and we're going to have effectively more contiguous prices from the last incremental resource to the next incremental resource, and that can supplant the LMP price. But when we call upon the resource, so this is the actual implementation, when we call upon the resource, we're going to call upon the resource at the minimum block quantity, but not necessarily, and correct me on this one, either one of you, not necessarily at that minimum block price when we call on the resource. It'll settle at the minimum block price, but it won't be called at the minimum block price, right? And if that's the case, then the moment that we call on that resource and we give it a specific dispatch level, that dispatch price becomes the LMP price. It'll be the SMEC. Right?
Generally speaking, yes, I follow your explanation, John. I would say, let me just step one more thing here. And again, this goes into the mechanics because as Jane was explaining, currently in our market, we have two passes. The first pass is to find the optimal schedules. to find the optimal commitment. And then in the pricing run, we come with this pricing run to determine the optimal prices. The optimal prices for the resources, that is not just the SMEC, but the full LMP, would be based on this fast start pricing mechanism that allows the internalization of this commitment discrete cost. So I would say, generally speaking, you expect to see higher LMPs, generally speaking. In terms of the dispatch, you will continue to see, as usual, a dispatch that tells you that you have to be following an instruction that is at least at the PMIN or higher, depending on your ramp. When we go into from one path to the other in the optimization of our market, once a commitment is determined in the scaling run, that is the one that determines the optimal commitments, we don't redo that in the pricing run. That now is our starting point, and we just have to find out what the right price is. And that is in general the principle that we follow for the reason to exist for this configuration between the scaling run and the pricing run. Pricing run is to clean up all the foundational framework that we put to get the right scales, but now we're looking to getting the nice, clearing final prices. And in terms of megawatts, dispatches, commitments, you will not see materially a difference on that. Potentially, you may see more or less commitments depending how the unit is set up, but you wouldn't see suddenly out of the blue infeasible scales to follow.
Right, right. And I guess that's the area that I'm getting confused in, is that effectively, if I'm understanding that I'm not seeing a difference in commitment, I'm not seeing a difference in dispatch, but for some reason, as you're kind of mentioning, overall, I'm seeing an increased LMP, right? And I would not expect to see an increased LMP in the fast pricing run versus the current more discrete version of the runs, because I would expect in the discrete version, you're going to have the discontinuities, right? You're going to have the jumps in price because you have to jump for the full block to the next bid, to whatever the next lowest bid is, whatever that may be. Whereas with the fast ramping or fast start pricing, the idea is that you can do a smoother transition. Okay, so I would expect the LMPs to be lower if you're going to be using that as part of your pricing, or at minimum to be the same as under the discrete method, not to be higher.
Actually, I think I have to indicate that generally speaking, I would expect the opposite to hold true. We would expect that generally speaking, under typical conditions, that prices will tend to be higher. If not the same, potentially higher, but not generally speaking lower, by the fact that now the bids that are used to clear in the pricing run are higher, because you have this extra adder into the bids that naturally is going to push the bids up. And so even clearing for the same demand level, you have moved up the bid stack higher, and therefore the price is going to be higher. So that I would expect to be the natural consequence of fast start pricing. To what extent, to what magnitude the price are going to be higher than the current discrete option, that is one of the items that we want to start exploring, how material, how meaningful that implication is going to be.
Right, but then under that, the bid will be higher because of the adder, but the bids still have to be monotonically increasing, in which case it could be readily argued that it is in the participant's favor to not have the adder, and that way our bids remain what our bids were before. So the fast start pricing doesn't really benefit us to incorporate into the system, unless you wanted to try to, because again, the system still has to jump to that next megawatt, right? It can't, for lack of a better phrase, it can't just have unserved and say the market price is not sufficiently high enough and we're just going to not serve the energy. Instead, it's going to use some mechanism to make that jump, even if it has to force it first to jump and then adjust the price after. which is effectively what I think is going on between the scheduling run and the pricing run, right? Scheduling run is going to make the move to make sure that the demand is met, and then the pricing run is going to come after the fact and then apply prices to those movements.
Yes, that's right characterization. Now, let me expand on one of the practical implications this may have, and I don't know if this has been discussed in any of the previous rounds, because I have indicated very strongly that we will not be sending invisible schedules if it happens that we implement any variation of fast start pricing. However, one of the items that actually is in this next slide is regarding the imbalance created by fast start pricing. And I think specifically that is an area that we have to assess how meaningful that could be, because it's not resource-specific concern, it's more about system concern. If there are too many units or a large volume of capacity dispatch in this dead zone between 0 and P-min, that effectively is an imbalance created for the supply equals demand condition in the system, because we are saying, okay, we are going to dispatch a unit that is that has a P-min of, let's say, 100 megawatts, and according to the pricing, we are going to schedule that to 10 megawatts. The difference is an imbalance created in the pricing run. As long as that is contained within the pricing run, there is no material implication on the balancing of the system. But again, we have to go back to the current implementation that we have, where we are still using the scales from the pricing run. So I appreciate your candor in the discussion, John. There are very good comments that we have to consider, and I would really like to make sure that you please submit the written comments to ensure that we don't lose this interesting and very critical conversation, and we can use that to inform us on what type of scenarios we want to analyze. Thank you so much for your feedback.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Juan, do we have anybody else on the line? Or
we have James's hand, who I believe might have been in. James, would you like to add anything there? And then we do have another question in the chat.
I would just like to offer to John and to other stakeholders who are in similar positions that let's connect. And we have I think either last fall or early spring this year, we had a couple of workshops that had really detailed numerical examples talking about the mechanics. And I think it'd be really helpful to review those and you know, help that maybe answer some questions. So we'll make sure John and any other stakeholders that are interested in those knows where to find that information. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, James. And the notice for this meeting itself did have a link to one of them, and we will leverage that the stakeholder initiative page to provide that further information for everybody here. So Guillermo, we do have a question in the chat that I'll read out loud here from Sybil at PGP. I thought one of the challenges of implementing Fast Start was the interaction with the FlexiRamp product. Will this analysis explore that interaction or impact at all?
Oh yeah, that's the million-dollar question. I would say with the framework that we're envisioning to start this analysis, it would be complicated to be able to incorporate FRP, flexible ramping product implications, just because of the fact that we are not expecting to have a multi-interval optimization, but rather to have this discrete interval by interval optimization. And the flexible ramping product is really a ramping capability approach that inherently is defined by the movement between two adjacent intervals. So you have to have the movement from the current interval to the next interval, and that movement is what defines the ramp capability. And that really means that if we want to have some type of FRP implication, we need to have at least that multi-interval setup, which by now we were not expecting to have, at least for the first stage. So I think that is a valid point that we have to table and see if eventually we're able to find a way to incorporate in this effect. You are right that FRP was one of the elements that we discussed in our responses to FERC and when was this order explaining the complications of the interaction of flexible ramping product with the energy. And that is one still a factor that we have to figure out in the discussion of the principles and the key elements in the design.
All right, so that definitely kind of spurred some conversation on here. So why don't we go ahead, let's let Michael kind of add to that response, and then we can move to Stuart. Michael, why don't you go ahead?
Yes, thanks. Mike Cadwallader again here. I just thought I'd mention that, in some of the examples that we were looking at back in the winter and spring, they included, they included the FRP product, both the FRD and the FRU prices, and we were exploring how essentially the price would reflect how it would be calculated in a fast start pricing environment, how effectively it would include the opportunity costs associated with either a resource down or moving a resource up in order to have it positioned to meet load in the down order, the upward load scenarios in the next interval. So that might be something to move.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that, Mike. James, if you want to add, Stuart, we see your hand, but James, if you want to add on to that one, go ahead.
Yeah, just a process comment. So I appreciate Guillermo and Mike's responses in tandem. I just want to connect that Sybil's question indeed is $1 million question, and within this working group will not ignore that. And we did some, as Mike mentioned, we did some work on that in the workshops previously, and we'll eventually look to expand on that type of work. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Let's go ahead and unmute Stuart. Stuart, go ahead.
One, yeah, I think Sybil's spot on, and I just want to support that analytics of FRP. I mean, if FRP, and there's been a lot of time spent on it, is working correctly, it kind of negates somewhat the need for FSP, and I do worry that CAISO's chasing a number of new products now, and I'm fearful of overlap of those products. So I just support Sybil's statement. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. When you say, well, perhaps this is something that we get into in the feedback discussion. I want to fight pulling on sort of what you mean by analysis on. Let's come back to that on analysis on FlexRamp. I'd like to get a little bit more detail there. Sylvie, I saw your hand go up. Would you like to add?
I changed my mind. Let's keep going, and I'll let you know if it's relevant.
All right, let's go ahead and move to the next slide here. Oh, I apologize, Guillermo. Before you launch into this, we do have another question here from Sybil at PGP. Wasn't there a follow-up analysis on the nodal FRP implementation that was in process that has been published? Could it be shared? Because she assumed it was meant to actually address some of these similar benchmarks.
Yes, we have been reporting on the performance of the nodal FRP since we went live on February 1st, 2023. We have had at least 2 rounds of analysis, and they were capturing the market participant discussions that we call the Market Performance Forum, the MPPF. I know we just have one a couple of weeks ago, and we have one more back in June. The material is publicly available in the sections of recurring meetings. You just look for MPPF, and maybe we can send the link in one later today. And we explore the performance of the FRP going from the performance of the calculation of the requirements, the definitions of the test, that now we have this concept of the passing group, then going into how the procurement mix has changed since the implementation of the nodal FRP, how now it's wider distributed across the entire footprint, the prices, and then the congestion and the deliverability. That was the main driver for the policy change implemented in February. So we can send you the link in, should be, if you cannot find it, but yes, we have been reporting on that. And you have to keep in mind that depending on the version of the analysis that you are looking at, there are some caveats because we have taken this stepwise incremental approach of beefing up what is implemented for FRP. It was until September when we added more transmission constraints. It is until then that we can have a more robust set of constraints, transmission constraints, under which we can stress test how the FRP is working. So there is plenty of material. We would be happy to send you the link for that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that, you know, we can kind of keep citing, leveraging that stakeholder initiative page of the sessions as well. So good question, Sybil, and we'll have that available for the stakeholder community to digest. All right, Guillermo, I do not see any other hands nor questions in the chat. Take it.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Juan. And now, taking for granted that we're going to have this approach based on sensitivity analysis that accounts for different scenarios, and given the assumption that we're going to define what the scenarios are going to be, and hopefully we can get feedback from participants to help us shape the set of the scenarios, there are some standard metrics that we can assess for each of these scenarios, typically just a benchmark against the standard pricing that we have. And the typical suspects are prices. We want to see how the prices are impacted in the different areas, in the through the day, through the period of time. I would expect that we can do this for at least a full year, if not more, to be able to see seasonal conditions at what time of the year, at what time of the day, and so on. So there are different dimensions how we can stratify the analysis for price impact. The second natural metric that we want to track is the impacts on the bit cost recovery, right? Current logic versus any of these scenarios, see how that change, how that leans towards one type of resources, one type of technology, how much it reduces or increases in any direction. Cost changes, not just the bit cost recovery, but the settlements of the energy, how dramatically that is going to change by any of the different scenarios. And interesting enough, we want to also explore who is setting the price, how frequently the certain technology is setting the price, what type of resources, what type of time definitions they are setting the price, just to start getting the feeling of where this is really becoming material. And the piece that I already touched earlier has to do with imbalance. This is no more than keep an eye on the efficiency of the fast start pricing for the potential implication that this may have in the balancing of the system. Now, what I was telling you before, right, that if there is a solution in which we determine that a resource is going to be dispatched between 0 and P-min, when in reality the instruction that we're going to be sending is the P-min, the optimization may have cleared other resources at different megawatts to make a space for that imbalance when we send the instructions, and if they eventually are based on the price and run, that is again the complexity we have to figure out how to address. Now, the original resources that were dispatched in such a way to accommodate that imbalance are going to continue to have that dispatch, but now the resource that got this dispatch in the middle of the P-min is going to get a dispatch for P-min. So there is this imbalance naturally created in the power balancing of the system, that if that is big enough could be material, right? And that is something that we have to consider. But again, it's highly predicated on how we reconcile the current methodology of using the pricing run with any variation of the fast start pricing. Next slide, please. And just to prove the concept, and this is something, again, that we did in an exploratory phase a couple of years ago, and it was confined only for the CAISO balancing area. Based on the real-time conditions, we came with these 6 different scenarios, and we have 2 dimensions to play with these scenarios. The benchmark is just pricing under current conditions, discrete commitments, and no consideration in any way for minimum uptime or fast start units. Then we have 2 sets of scenarios. 1 to 3 is for one kind of similar scenario in which we allowed the pricing run to dispatch resources anywhere between 0 to Pmax, even in the dead zone of 0 to Pmin. Concurrent with putting the adder to the variable cost to reflect, to internalize the minimum load cost and the startup cost. That would be scenario 1, 2, and 3. And then scenario 4, 5, and 6 is the same setup, but we don't internalize the commitment cost. It's just to allow resources to be dispatched anywhere between 0 and Pmin. Effectively, the only thing that we do is to extend the first segment of the bit all the way to 0 so that it can be dispatched flexibly between 0 and the first segment of the variable range. And then the other dimension to these scenarios is the definitions of the startup times. For the benchmark, it's just not a relevant factor, right? We just consider all resources committed in a discrete fashion. But for the different scenarios, we explore 3 different permutations, applying that logic of fast start pricing for any resource that has a startup of 50 minutes or less. Second scenario, same logic, but for resources that have a startup time of 60 minutes or less. And the third scenario, the extreme cases where we applied that logic of flexible or faster pricing to all resources, regardless of how long it takes to start up. That could be kind of extreme, but we want to see where the upper bound potentially could be. And with these scenarios, we just do the back of the envelope estimates using all the bits, all the resource characteristics and conditions that we have for 2021. And we are using 2021 again because we did this analysis effectively early into, actually at the end of 2021. Next slide, please. Aidan, can we? Okay, thank you. And here is just one illustration. When we compare the benchmark, standard pricing versus any of these 6 permutations of fast start pricing, how the prices look like. There is a dotted line trend that stands for the standard pricing, that is the current pricing methodology. And then the bars stand for the fast start pricing prices. And you have 6 subplots. Each of those represent one scenarios that I listed before. If you look at the first column of the 2, this is when we have the definition of startup time, and also we amortize the cost in the variable range. So we are allowing resources with 15 minutes or less of a startup time to set the price, and we internalize that commitment cost in the variable range. And the second column, the three rows will be for each of the scenarios of the definition of the startup time, but in this case we don't factor in the commitment cost in the variable bit. It's only the relaxation between 0 and Pmin that allows to set the price based on the first segment bit price. And as expected, overall, in general, you would expect that the prices are going to be higher with faster pricing because you have this extra adder. And or even if you don't have the adder with the second column, you allow the minimum range to be able to set the price in the first with the first bit price. Depending on how optimistic or restrictive you are with setting the units that are subject to the faster pricing, you can see that the price can go from a small impact to greater impact, right? The upper left corner would be when you have only the logic applied to units with 15 minutes or less of startup time. And the one at the bottom on the left would be when you apply that logic to every single unit that could be in the mix of commitments. And you can see how dramatic the price would be in that case. So you want to take a reference, I would say the first case is potentially one end of the spectrum, the minimum that could be applied to the fast start pricing, very contained to the very few units that are indeed fast start units, and we apply some way to amortize the commitment cost. There is a table on the left that just gives you the summary for the whole year for each of these scenarios, in general, how the price changes. And you can see that depending on the scenario, you can have price changes in the range of anywhere between 13% to 27%. Again, this is just a prototype based on that specific version of the fast start pricing that we wanted to explore. We are not indicating that that should be the logic to be pursued. It's the fact that we have to pick one to prove the concept. Next slide, please. This one is just to give you a sense of the distribution of the price changes, right? Averages are great, but it hides a lot of information. And here you have a distribution plot for the same 60 scenarios in the same structure, just to give you a sense of where the price changes are clustered depending on the scenario. First, you are going to see that most of the time, the prices are in one direction. The changes of the price are in one direction. They are going to increase. And that is the reason you are going to see very few instances where there is a distribution in the negative range. And that, again, is expected. It's a natural consequence of having higher bids setting the price. And the distribution, you can see that there are some outliers, some spikes that you can see in some cases can reach up to 800. That was a very interesting case. And I believe that was February when we have these extreme gas prices. So I think it's just a reflection of the conditions of the system, but still could be a good reference to indicate that, yeah, look at how it looks under very extreme conditions like in the cold weather of the 2021 around February. And then you can see that the majority of the price changes are clustered in a small range above zero and maybe in $10. And depending on the scenario, you can see that that distribution can be more or less spread. You go to the case where we apply that logic to all resources, the lower left corner, you can see that the prices tend to be more, the price changes tend to be in the higher range. We have two more slides. Let's move to the next one, please. This is prices again, but the profile here is on an hourly basis. And we can see in the previous one how seasonally they change. Here you see how they change through the day for the whole year. This is summarizing, oh sorry, this is only for the month of April. We pick a month of lighter loads and plenty of production from renewable resources. And then we also have the one for August when you have these tight stress system conditions. And nothing surprising here, you can see that the logic remains the same. You have higher prices with the faster pricing. Through the hourly profile, they tend to spike in the hours that matter. That could be either typically early in the morning peak or in the evening peak when we really reach the maximum loading conditions of the system. So it's expected to see this type of profile even for the month of April. And the next slide, please, accounts for the month of August. And prices are going to be higher, naturally, because we are in higher levels of demand. That means that the system is going to naturally be clearing at higher levels of the bid stack that are priced higher. And on top of that, you have now the extra other of the commitment cost that is just going to increase the prices accordingly. Profiles for the hour seems to be along the expectation that we have in the summer conditions, where you really peak in the evening to match either the gross or the net load peak. These are just a sample of the metrics that we expect to do for the scenarios that we have to define, and for the variation of the methodology that we could potentially explore for the fast start pricing. Again, this is just to show you the proof of concept that, yeah, this type of analysis can be done, and granted with the approximations and assumptions that we have to use to be able to build the framework of this type of analysis. And I think that's all what we have for this second part. Can we see if we have any other slide next that belongs to the analysis? This is the last one for the analysis.
No, Guillermo, you're correct. That is the final slide there. So we did get a question in the chat here. Kyle Navis at Cal Advocates. These scenarios, if we could go back to that last slide, please. Did these scenarios tell us anything about reliability? I see a lot of price increases, but is there a commensurate increase or improvement in reliability, or is that not a component of this type of scenario analysis?
Yeah, and that is not within the scope of this type of analysis. We would have to first put some time to think about how we can effectively come with a metric that allows us to measure impacts on the reliability of the system. We are open to that, but this so far is purely from the market perspective.
Thank you very much, Guillermo. Really appreciate your time and laying this out for us. The next slide here is really kind of getting back into the discussion with you, the stakeholders, on beginning the conversation, scoping this fast start pricing analysis. So before we launch this Slido poll, I do want to give an opportunity for perhaps other questions, and we do have a couple coming in. So Sybil, I want to go back to one of your questions that you asked a little while back here. Make sure that we don't forget that. So Mike, this one's actually for you. Could you share if fast start resources are primarily dispatched in the day ahead and other markets are in real time? Curious if this informs the counterfactual concept that Guillermo just laid out, or the interpretation thereof.
Sure. So I don't know that I can make a blanket answer that would apply for all other markets, but I can say in my experience that it's primarily it's a real-time phenomenon. Basically what we're talking about when we're talking about fast start pricing is whether relatively expensive peaking units that aren't used that often, how prices would be set when they are started. And by and large, not always, but by and large, in the day ahead market, you'll have more options available because it's day ahead, and so it's somewhat less likely that those units will actually be scheduled to operate. Is that unheard of? No, it's not unheard of. There are circumstances where you might be scheduling them day ahead, but it's primarily a real time phenomenon in what I've seen.
Thanks, Mike. And if producer, sorry, if we could go back one slide, we got another one in the chat related to the analysis. So Guillermo, this one's for you. Did these price changes include any changes to bid cost recovery uplifts?
No, we have some metrics from that, but this was only prices. And there is this other complement that I indicated in previous slides that we have to look more holistically, and that includes changes to the bid cost recovery. And this one was just prices.
All right. Very good. Thank you so much for your time, Guillermo and Sylvie. Really appreciate you coming in and giving us this overview of both fast start pricing and potential analysis here. So to the stakeholder community here on this call, I think this is where we're really looking to you. We had a couple of really good questions here where, you know, Stuart, I'm going to kind of come back to you here, but let's do the Slido first. In essence, could you please provide us your feedback on the information that is needed for you for this initial analysis? Again, as Guillermo laid it out, we're really looking to scope this analysis. It would be iteratively done, so we would be coming back here in a future working group session to present that, to get further feedback, further refinement. But the end goal here, after a couple iterations, is to have something scoped out that can inform a discussion of, you know, fast start pricing's inclusion into the California ISO market. So what is the information needed for that initial analysis? We have the Slido up, so please do go ahead. We are also open to verbal, so raise your hand as well. This is a discussion for us to really ensure that we are providing you with what you need for an informed conversation. So let's give that a moment. And if anybody would like to raise their hand to ask, please do feel free. You know, Mike, while we have the stakeholder community here kind of giving us their feedback on the information they'd like to see for this first iteration, are there any comments or questions, things that you might want to add kind of based off of the presentation here so far?
I think really the only thing that occurs to me is that I just wanted to emphasize, and this was raised earlier, but I just want to reemphasize it, that the so there was a graphical representation essentially of the modified supply curve compared to the originally submitted supply curve. So the modified supply curve, it includes an allocation of the commitment costs over the capacity of the unit. And as it was discussed earlier, that is one way to do it. That's not necessarily the only way or the best. To the extent that we were to use a different mechanism for allocating those costs over the capacity of the unit, that will affect the modified supply curve, and hence it would affect the impact that using fast start pricing has on prices. So it's just important to go ahead and bear that in mind, that essentially that the calculations we've seen here are based upon that one particular approach for capacity costs and allocating them over the capacity of the unit to come up with a modified supply curve.
Thank you for that, Mike. Any reactions to that? Or we can kind of, I see the Slido poll kind of coming in here. Appreciate that. Let's give that a moment and we'll go ahead and publish those results. And we can take those and kind of have further discussion here. So again, what is the information? We had a couple of items here. Guillermo proposed or didn't propose, or rather presented, again, kind of a proof of concept of how one of these studies could be done. So we're looking for your feedback of what to be included in here. And we had a couple of questions throughout that presentation that I think could kind of come over into this portion of helping us scope this analysis. And then, producer, just to be clear, the results are coming in here. They're visible to everybody, or we should leave that open until you publish it?
Once you enter your answer, you should be able to see it.
Got it. Okay.
The only thing is if you don't enter your answer or enter a answer, you won't see it. You'll just still see the question.
Got it. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
All right. So let's go ahead and start digging into some of these items here. So the thank you to the working group. I agree. I think our subject matter experts did a fabulous job. So I will also echo that. And again, this analysis, the question for those of you who are still typing, or the comment for those of you who are still typing, it goes on to say it's unclear where the problem lies that FSP is starting, or I guess solving. You know, this analysis is in order to kind of inform that further discussion, kind of in a different stance than our scarcity or MPM conversation. What we're looking to accomplish in this first phase is to have that analysis completed. We're looking to your feedback, because that analysis is meant for you, the stakeholder community, to be able to have an informed discussion, right? So we're really looking for what information you would be looking for to feel like we would be prepared to have that discussion. So next comment here is looking at the pricing differentials without analyzing the impact of BCR provides no insight into the impact of the fast start pricing concept. You know, I think that's, I'd like to stop there and see if anybody has any reactions to that, or if the ISO would like to respond to that, and but the inclusion of, or the potential inclusion of there.
Juan, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, James. In essence, incorporating the impact of BCR, the question or the statement is looking at pricing differentials without analyzing the impact to BCR provides no insight to the impact of FSP as a concept.
Okay, I can take the first answer to that, Juan. Yes, we don't disagree with that, and that's indeed in the scope of this first stage. Let me just clarify that the fact that I didn't show up in that in the prototype that we have doesn't mean that we don't account for that, and we have it, and we have many more metrics. It was just to show that, yes, we can come with the results, but the VCR, the cost impact, and the other element that we described previously in one of the slides are going to be part of that scope.
Yeah, thank you for that, Guillermo. And again, I think that kind of highlights, again, this was a proof of concept and not a proposal for the analysis, to serve as a starting point, so that we can capture comments like that and make sure that we're scoping this appropriately. So another one, what is the objective of fast start pricing analysis will not cover whether it increases reliability. Guillermo, you did kind of address that to Kyle's question earlier in the session here, that there are the potential for us to have other variables to include into that analysis. I'm not sure if anybody in the stakeholder community wants to kind of expand upon that, or Guillermo, if you want to respond to that, it would be something that we could take a look at.
Well, I think we are open to consideration of other factors, variables. I think having this discussion is important for us to learn if we are missing any critical component here. So I think participants know where we are projecting the scope to be. So I think that's now the right time for them to provide that feedback if we are missing or they want to see anything else.
All right, so comments are definitely rolling in here. So I think, Sybil, thank you at PGP. I think we generally support the idea, but would like it if there was a way for one of the scenarios to pick up on the novel design that is compatible with FRP that was presented previously. If that interaction is, quote unquote, the $1 million question, it would be great if we could keep that relationship in scope somehow. So Sybil, I appreciate, and that is definitely here in my notes, and I think you also had a couple of other people chime in the chat, kind of in support of that, you know, the inclusion of the interaction of flex analysis being included. So I really really appreciate everybody weighing in and allowing us to learn what it is that you feel that we need to have within this analysis here. Information on any benefits of fast start pricing comparable to the increase in cost would be useful. Yeah, that's an anonymous comment. Sylvia, I see your hand up, but I'd like to. Well, so why don't we go to you, and then I'll make my comment, see if we can't get some of the stakeholder community here to react to that.
Yeah, so I'll reflect on a couple of comments before I directly answer the price increase, but I noted that many stakeholders are saying we're not sure what the problem is, or we'd like an idea of what the policy goals here are. And I think this initial analysis will help us do that, that scoping to tell us if there's a problem, because we've heard from the stakeholder community that in their experience, they believe that the way the market works can be improved. So step one, see if there's a problem through the lens of fast start pricing. And then in terms of that question of the trade-off between an increase in price, we've also heard from the stakeholder community that there is a difference in the incentives between something like an opportunity cost recovery payment and a bid cost recovery. Not all uplift may be equal. So we'll have to have a conversation around what those price signals mean and whether or not one is more efficient than the other. But cross that bridge when we get to it.
Thanks, Sylvie. And just to confirm, is my audio coming through okay now?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, appreciate that. So since the analysis is using historical data based on 2021, is there the ability to perform a sensitivity analysis to recognize that energy storage will be a far greater role in the future compared to 2021 levels? Guillermo, I'm not sure if you want to take this one. I know that we did talk about the historical use of data for the counterfactual. Would you like to respond to that?
Yes. I was not explicit, but I don't expect that we're going to continue to rely on 2021. I think that was the reference because we were basically living the end of 2021 when we implemented this. But now that we are catching up, I expect that we can use more recent information like 2022 or even 2023, which naturally will reflect the steep increase of the storage resources that we have relative to 2021. If we wanted to use even 2023 as a projection for the future, I think that is where the assumptions may break it or make it, and we would have to discuss realistically what good assumptions can be made to make projections, because cost is obviously a factor. Location potentially could also be something to consider. So we will have to be very mindful what assumptions we could potentially even take to make projections into the future. Retrospectively, I feel very confident because it's what we already have, but any future projections will be more sensitive to have strong elements of the criteria to make these assumptions.
No, thank you. Well, we have quite a bit of just kind of background or more detailed information, the types of resources, the number of resources considered in this scenario, the number of intervals. So this is all great feedback. Really appreciate everybody sharing here. Let's see, metrics on the resources would be useful to see further detail on the cost of the units. No, appreciate this feedback, guys. This is exactly what we're looking for. So let's go ahead. Adrian, I believe you can see if people are still providing feedback via the Slido poll. Do we currently have folks that are providing their response?
No, there haven't been any more responses for a while. We're at 20 responses so far.
Very good. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. And again, you will also have an opportunity to kind of think about this and provide us with any additional, data slices or pieces of information you'd like to see or present to us for this analysis via the comments. Why don't we go ahead and let's publish or close the Slido and kind of move on to the next slide here. So speaking of those comments, we do want to, at a high level, kind of let the community know what it is that we took away from the last set of comments. And this is something that the internal team here has been talking about. So again, this is just kind of general updates here, the themes, so to speak, that we saw there. And this is kind of what we've heard. And if anybody would like to kind of expand upon that or react to these items, please raise your hand and would be happy to have that discussion. So one of the things we definitely heard was the need for or desire for illustrative analysis or examples or history prior to these meetings to inform these discussions. We will be, again, leveraging that stakeholder initiative page and pushing out more level set material, reference material, so that we can spend more of our time within the sessions actually getting into the issues themselves and kind of providing that analysis. A lot of requests for data. Please do let us know via your comments. The team is committed to providing more information kind of up front. And so if there are specific items, which many of you have provided, that you would like for us to consider as we produce that material prior to future sessions, please put those in your comments so we can have those under consideration when we're going through that material creation. The other item that we heard was the planning for the upcoming sessions and really defining which topics will be discussed. Now, this was a working group session that we pulled fast start pricing into. Again, we're going to go back to the scarcity and BAA level MPM conversation here shortly at the next session. But we hear the need for planning, the need for managing bandwidth and planning your work. So we will be putting forth a calendar of the next several sessions. We're going to be getting into the thematic sessions and which theme will be discussed in each one of those sessions. And speaking of those thematic sessions, we also appreciate everybody letting us know kind of their priority ranking of those themes. It was definitely the review of the existing ISO market mechanisms, and we'll be leveraging different mediums to provide more information again on that theme prior to that next session. One of the comments we also heard several times here, and I want to talk about this one, and if anybody has a reaction, please do raise your hand, was the value of the ISO presenting draft problem statements, and they are draft, right, to kind of initiate that further discussion and to go alongside the inclusion of stakeholder proposed problem statements. But I think we want this to be representative of what are the issues the stakeholder community is seeing, being able to capture and identify those issues, and then further on being able to kind of discuss the things that need to be under consideration when we're developing solutions to those within policy development. I think that the last session, we definitely, this is in response to that feedback. We want to provide more upfront. We want to have give you the opportunity to digest some of that material or the concepts and come with your ideas more formulated. And we're also here to kind of help start that conversation. So we will continue with the draft problem statements. For those of you, there were entities who also proposed their own problem statements, and those are definitely going to be included in the discussion. We really appreciate that, but we will do our piece here to initiate that discussion in each one of those themes. If we could go ahead and move to the, well, let me pause there. Any further any feedback or any reactions to anything that I just said there, kind of from a working group process perspective? All right, you guys are taking it easy on me today. No hands. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit, or actually, let me go ahead and hand this off to Caitlin to wrap us up. So Caitlin, the floor is yours.
Sure, thank you. So close it out, we'll go through next steps. So on the revised discussion paper, please provide feedback through the commenting tool. We're asking that those comments incorporate your feedback from this session. And then the working group session 7 is tentatively scheduled for October 25th, but we'll send out a notice to confirm that meeting. Next slide, please. Again, the commenting tool can be accessed from the initiative webpage. So that first bullet point there is the web link to the initiative webpage for price formation enhancements. If you do have any questions on the next steps, you can send an email to Brenda Corona or ISO Stakeholder Affairs at CAISO.com, and we'll make sure to get that question answered for you. Next slide, please. And then if you haven't already, we always encourage you to take a look at the Energy Matters blog. There's a link there in that first bullet point. We recently posted some great articles on the October 14th eclipse and the evolution of the WEIM. Next slide, please. And again, the next working group will be noticed, so just hang tight. You'll see that in the daily briefing. And we look forward to seeing you at the next working group session. Thanks again for your time today, and thank you to all of our panelists. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for your time. You may all now disconnect.